Hey, say something. You can hear me, can't you? My mother-in-law and husband are in the same living room, but they act as if they can't hear me.
Hey, Mom, do you hear something?
What?
I don't hear a thing.
Seeing the two of them giggling and laughing, I held back my tears, packed up my belongings, and ran out of my parents-in-law's house. My name is Miranda. I'm 42 years old. And I'm feeling very good after my boss took me to an expensive Italian restaurant. I was in hell until 5 years ago. I was living with my husband Frank. I met Frank on a blind date and we became friends because we were the same age and could talk normally without generation gap. I naturally made a promise for a second date.
At first, I was worried about the blind date, but now, thinking back, I'm glad I went. Because I met you, Miranda.
I blushed like a young girl. We had been dating for 6 months, and Frank proposed to me, and I accepted. Frank's parents had told him that it was time for us to get married, and I had been told by my father that I should get myself married. So I was open to the idea of marriage. Then, about a month after we got married, he said to me,
Sorry, Miranda. I got drunk the other night after a drinking party.
Then someone stole my wallet and used my credit card.
I can't even pay rent now.
So let's live with my mom, Frank said to me as he got down on his knees. I was really surprised by his confession. When I didn't hear back from Frank after he went drinking, I went to look for him and found him sitting and sleeping in a corner of an alley near our apartment. I guess he must have had his wallet stolen before I found him. But this was the first time hearing about him having his wallet stolen. But living at your parents' house? All of a sudden. I can just pay the rent, can I? I said. Frank shook his head.
Do you know the monthly rent for this house? There's no way you can afford it.
I was caught off guard by Frank's words. The rent for this apartment is not that expensive. I think it was less than $800. So why does he think I can't afford the rent? Maybe Frank is the one who thinks that I cannot pay the rent. Frank must not know how much money I make. But I didn't have time to correct him about my earnings.
I've already told my mom that we're going to live there. So you don't have to worry about anything.
What? You've already told her? Before even consulting me about it, my husband had been moving forward with the idea of moving in with his mother. I felt like I was going to lose consciousness. I'm not that good with dealing with my mother-in-law. The first time Frank took me to his house, I told her about my university and where my parents worked. Then, she sighed loudly and said,
What's wrong with you?
Frank has chosen a very ordinary woman, she said in a loud voice. At that time, Frank went to the kitchen to get himself another cup of tea. So I am sure he did not hear his mother said that. I was so surprised to hear my mother-in-law's words that I froze. It is true that your educational background and the place of work of equal science may be important, but I don't think you can know everything about a person just from that. However, my mother-in-law felt like she knew everything about me. When we got engaged and I went to visit her again, she raised an eyebrow and said,
I'll allow you to marry him, but don't be a burden to Frank,
she said to me in a very spirit way. My mother-in-law must really not want me to be Frank's wife. I felt heavy at the thought of living with such a mother-in-law. It seemed that my mother-in-law's personality would not change even if we become a family. A few years before I met Frank, a man who would become my father-in-law couldn't bear to live with my mother-in-law. I heard that he divorced her because he couldn't take it anymore. When I asked Frank what really happened,
who knows? It happened after I left home, and it was probably out for some stupid fight,
is what he told me. And it didn't seem like he thought too hard about his parents' divorce. I'm sure my mother-in-law said something out of line. From the first time I met her, I didn't have a good impression of my mother-in-law. And my uneasiness turned out to be right on target. When Frank and I came to my parents-in-law's house on the day of our move-in, my mother-in-law said to Frank. "Welcome, Frank. You can go rest in the living room. I'll bring you tea and snacks." She invited him into the living room as if she were welcoming a small child. But to me, she said, "Can you put your things away already? I'm accepting this sudden move-in with you, you know." She glared at me as she said it. I don't know why she was so mean to me, but I had no choice but to instruct the moving company to move my belongings and unpack afterwards. I was sure that Frank would take care of his own unpacking, but he came to see me how much progress I had made and said, "Oh, you haven't finished unpacking my luggage at all. Usually, you would unpack the husband's things first, huh?" He said something crazy like that. I didn't want to get angry at him as soon as we moved in, so I said, "Well, I didn't know where or how to put your stuff." He said, "I guess that's true," and started to unpack his own luggage. After a while, my mother-in-law came to check on us to see how we were doing. "What a lousy wife you are, making your husband do all the work," she said to me. "I don't think it's right for a husband to leave everything to his wife." I was worried that I wouldn't be able to make it like this from the first day. But I knew I must not give up. In the first place, I had no idea why I was doing this. I didn't say anything in response to my mother-in-law's words. I think she's getting carried away and making fun of me. If she says something to me again, I will say it back to her. However, that decision may have been wrong. It was after we had finished unpacking, and Frank and I had left for work. Frank's office was closer to the house compared to my office. So, even if we had the same regular work hours, Frank would come home earlier than me. So there's no way I can come home earlier than Frank and cook dinner for him. When I came home later than Frank, my mother-in-law said to me, "Miranda, why don't you try to cook dinner for your husband? Shouldn't you be home by the time he gets home? And have dinner ready?" She stood at the door and started to lecture me. I was not even allowed to take off my shoes to go up to the house. So this time, I thought I had to tell my mother-in-law, "Sarah, I work too. I am a full-time employee like Frank. I work at the same time as Frank, but my workplace is further away. If we finish work at the same time, it is impossible for me to come home earlier than Frank." I told my mother-in-law that so as not to get emotional. Then, my mother-in-law couldn't say anything back to me. She turned red and retreated to the living room. I sighed and took off my shoes and went into the house. That was when Frank and my mother-in-law started to ignore me. At first, I thought they just didn't hear me. If I said something for a second time and spoke a little louder, they both responded, and we were able to have a conversation about the important things. However, after 6 months or a year of such a situation, even I realized that something was wrong. "Frank, are you and your mother avoiding me?" When I asked him this when I was alone with Frank, he looked at me annoyed. "How can that be? Why would anyone avoid their family? Aren't you just imagining things?" He said. I hope that it was just my imagination. But since then, Frank and my mother-in-law's ignoring became blatant. "Frank, about this month's bills." Frank ignores me even when I talk to him. I raised my voice to ask him if he didn't hear me, but then he would get up from his seat and go to his room. Even to my mother-in-law, "Sarah, about today's dinner?" But she would stare at the TV screen and would not look at me. I called out to her repeatedly, and my mother-in-law turned up the volume on the TV to drown out my voice. The TV was so loud that I held my ears and ran away. This kept happening, and I kept thinking, why in the world is this happening? Did I do something wrong? I was depressed for days. I still did all the household chores such as laundry, cleaning, cooking, and such. My mother-in-law did the housework when I was not around, and I think we had a functioning household that was at least livable. If I just spent my time without saying a word, surely we would both learn to talk to each other properly. So I thought. And 2 years had passed since Frank and I came to live with his mother. I met someone from my work, and after listening to his story, a question came to my mind about Frank. I wanted to ask Frank about it, but he still did not respond my questions. Finally, I got impatient and said, "Hey, say something. It's not like you can't hear me." Frank and my mother-in-law are both in the same living room. It's not like they can't hear me.
Hey, Mom, can you hear anything?
What?
I don't hear anything.
They laughed without looking at me. That's when I realized, oh, these people just want to hurt me. This is not my family anymore. With that thought in mind, I packed up my belongings and left the house. When I left the divorce papers which I had signed, but when I went to the city office a short time later to check, I found that the divorce papers had been filed immediately after that, and I had returned to being single. After fleeing my husband and his mother, I decided to go back to my parents' house to heal my broken heart. I didn't like the idea of Frank knowing where I worked, so I took the plunge and changed jobs. And when my life had settled down, I moved out of my parents' house and started living on my own. I met the man of my dream at my new job. The man I met was Jim. And we first met at a coffee shop that was in the same building as my workplace. He dropped his wallet while he was paying the bill in the coffee shop, and I joined him in line to pick up the coins that had fallen out of his wallet. He then said thank you to me and bought me the coffee I was about to order. We didn't know each other's name at the time, and I thought we would never see each other again. But then, he and I ran into each other again at work. I thought this was a great coincidence, and after work I told him, "Thank you for your coffee," I said. And he shook his head in a panic.
"You're the one who helped me, so you don't have to thank me,"
he said. After 3 years of such coincidence, Jim finally said to me,
"I'd like to date you. If it's okay with you?"
He confessed to me, and I told him yes. With my ex-husband Frank, I met him on a blind date and I got married before I had much time to get to know him, which was a terrible experience. But with Jim, I had 3 years to get to know him. So, with peace of mind, I decided to go out with him. He trusted me too. Then he asked me to move in with him first, instead of getting married, so we started living together. Then, 4.5 years after Frank and I divorced, Jim and I got married. We decided that there was no need to have a big wedding. By that time, I had forgotten about Frank. But then, Frank contacted me for the first time in a really long time. I had forgotten to block his number because I had not even heard from him that I had filed for divorce. The wrapped text said,
"My mom passed away. Come to the funeral."
Why would I, the ex-wife, whom he divorced 5 years ago, have to attend his mother's funeral? I told this to Jim, my now husband, with a quizzical look on my face. He said,
"Do you want to go just for the wake?" "I'll go with you, because you've been a part of their life, and now you're my spouse,"
he told me. To be honest, I didn't want to see Frank, because I didn't want anything to do with his family again. But I also didn't want them to think, by not attending my ex-mother-in-law's funeral, I was just like them, by ignoring them. Besides, I have nothing to worry about if I have Jim by my side. It's not likely, but if Frank is trying to get back together with me and wants to invite me to his mother's funeral, I can deny the possibility completely because I have Jim. Looking back, I can't say that I've done anything about Frank's relationship, but ran away from it. Now I can finally put my past behind me. So I went with Jim to Frank's place. We were dressed in mourning clothes, like everyone else, and when Frank spotted me among the mourning people, he approached me with a grin on his face, unlike one at a funeral. I hadn't seen Frank in 5 years, and his face looked a little fuller than before, perhaps from inactivity, and his smirk was eerie.
"Hey, Miranda, you haven't deleted my number. So I guess you still have feelings for me, right? You really wasted your time too, didn't you? I can't believe you ran away from home and divorced me over something as trivial as that. I'll let you come back if you beg."
I was clearly uncomfortable with the look on his face. And he looked next to me, and suddenly his smile disappeared. Jim stares at Frank with a cold stare.
Do you have a problem with my wife?
He puts his hand on my shoulder as he said this. Seeing this, Frank's face turned pale and he began to shake.
Boss, this is... Whoa!
I tilted my head. It is true that Jim is the president of the company I work for, but I had no idea that it was related to Frank. What is he talking about? I looked at Jim and he said,
Actually, I didn't say anything to you, but I did look into your ex-husband to see what he did to you. I found out that this man had been fired from his previous company and that he had embezzled money.
My eyes widened. The reason I distrusted Frank when I was married to him was because I happened to hear about his job from someone who happened to be a colleague of his and an acquaintance of mine. Moreover, when his embezzlement was discovered and he was charged with money, that was when Frank told me we were going to live at his mother's house. It was then I realized that Frank was lying when he said his wallet had been stolen and his savings were empty. I tried to question him about it, and both he and my mother-in-law kept ignoring me, so I decided it was too much and ran away from home.
So, he was hired at a new company, and that company does business with our company, and he's in charge of it.
So that's why Frank is now pale and has beads of sweat on his forehead. And he just made a joke to the wife of the president of a major company that his company is now doing business with, that if she begged, she would take her back. Then Jim, who was standing next to me, said,
I've turned a blind eye to what you've done to my wife. Miranda and you are already divorced, and you were an employee of a business partner to me. And I try to keep my personal and work business separate. Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, can you pretend that I didn't say anything?
He was acting all high and mighty towards me, but after he saw Jim next to me, he was shaking like a little animal. I looked around. Besides Frank and his relatives, Frank's boss from the company he works for was also there. And he too came up to us, looking flustered.
I never thought I'd see you here. What's wrong, Mr. President?
Asked Frank's boss, wiping his sweat with a handkerchief. Jim sighed.
To tell the truth, my wife divorced this man 5 years ago. And he and his mother had been picking on her for about 2 years. I followed her here because I was worried about my wife.
Frank's boss said, are you kidding me? And grabbed Frank's shoulders. When asked, Frank replied, His eyes were shifting left and right. It was ridiculous how tiny Frank seemed compared to when he first came up to talk to me.
And when I attended the funeral with my wife, he immediately said that he would remarry her if she begged him. I'm really glad I followed my wife here,
Jim said. Frank's boss then said,
What the hell did you do?
He grabbed Frank by both shoulders and shook him.
I don't want to humiliate my wife any more than I already have. So, we're going to leave now. I don't mean to speak ill of any individuals, but this family has done terrible things to my wife. So I don't need to say anything else, do I?
Jim's words were answered not by Frank, but by Frank's boss.
Yes, as you wish. I'll make sure to scold him.
Frank looked like he lost everything. I wonder if he could serve as a funeral pallbearer in that condition. But it was none of my business or Jim's business. Jim and I decided that there was no need for us to be there. So we left. And a few days later, Jim told me,
I actually got a call from that trading company. It seems your ex-husband has been laid off.
I was surprised. Fired? I thought you didn't take personal feelings into your business.
I did, but it seems they didn't. I didn't say anything, but I got a call that he was fired. His boss said he was sorry for making you feel uncomfortable too. Apparently, he had been running up expenses at his current company, and that was a deciding factor in his termination.
I sighed. It's terrible that I was married to someone like that, I said, and Jim laughed and said,
Well, That divorce was the only reason I met you. I'm glad he divorced you so quickly.
I laughed and said that's true. Later, I heard through the grapevine that Frank was thinking of storming into my parents' house. But my parents' house had been torn down several years before, and my parents had moved to another place where a new house had been built. When you see a new house, you usually expect to find another family living there. But Frank thought that Jim and I were living there, so he started banging on the door in the middle of the night screaming,
Miranda, I lost everything because of you. You're responsible for this. You better pay me.
That was apparently what he was saying. The residents of the house immediately reported the incident, and he was taken away by the police. Apparently, Frank and his mother-in-law were not well liked among their relatives because of their bad character, and no one wanted to help Frank. One day, one of his relatives saw him standing in line at a soup kitchen, but he was so disfigured that they were not sure if it was him or not. I guess he's getting what he deserves for neglecting people's hurts. As for me, I have forgotten about him, and I'm now building a happy home with my kind husband.